So just over a week ago, Dr. Hilary Cass, the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, produced her much-awaited review of the NHS's gender identity services for children and young people. And the report found that the evidence base for gender medicine in young people was thin and children had been let down by a toxic public discourse around gender. And it also found that the now closed Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust used puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones despite remarkably weak evidence that they improved the health of young people. So here to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by the barrister and campaigner Sarah Phillimore. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you. Let's talk about the Cass review then. What do you think are the most important findings from your perspective?
Well, I think there's about 31 recommendations. A lot of it is about the service that children need.
Yes.
Because this clearly isn't a report saying being trans is wrong, let's stop it. It's saying there are lots of children who are very distressed, the current services are letting them down. So a lot of the recommendations are looking at the nitty-gritty of how services should develop. What I'm particularly interested in are the recommendations, well, obviously the puberty blockers, we already knew that they weren't going to be prescribed because the NHS changed its policy on the 14th of March.
Yes.
What's very interesting, though, is what she says about the cross-sex hormones, because the NHS did have quite a strict policy about how they were to be prescribed. Cass has said, because the evidence is so awful, I mean, you said it was thin. I think what the BMJ said, commenting on the Cass review, is that there is an evidence void. So she has said extreme caution is needed, and recommendation 9 is possibly the most interesting. There will have to be effectively a second opinion for any prescription. A multidisciplinary team will need to review any decision to prescribe to a 16-year-old. Now, that's interesting because no private clinic can offer that. And
yes.
There's one private clinic at the moment, Gender Plus, who is regulated by the CQC to prescribe hormones. Now, I think the CQC need to look again at its regulation criteria. And, of course, you're aware there is a judicial review coming of its decision to regulate Gender Plus.
Yes, well, I saw Dr. Alan Kelly, who was from a private gender clinic, sort of an interview on Novara Media, saying that we can prescribe these to you. Don't worry, you can go work around the NHS, effectively selling the drugs. But actually, it looks like that isn't going to be possible.
I hope it won't be. I mean, the thing about Dr. Kelly is we know his provenance. He comes from the Tavistock, and so do all his staff. They are wedded to the affirmation path. And that, to me, has been the most chilling thing about the reaction to the Cass review. Not, oh, crikey, we may have got this horribly wrong, but she's a transphobe, she's a fascist, it's wrong. Let's just get on with giving children what they say they need.
Although that was probably a predictable response from a lot of activists.
I'm shocked, perhaps naively so. I thought there'd be a lot more embarrassed silence. I didn't expect to see, for example, Patrick Harvey refusing to admit it was wrong to call this a transphobic report, even in the light of Dr. Cass reporting she's been advised not to use public transport now. I mean, have you ever known anything like this?
I mean, that element is, of course, very shocking. And, you know, this is one of the senior paediatricians in the world. You know, a rigorous report over 4 years. It should be taken seriously, absolutely. But you're right, a lot of people aren't doing so. So how do we deal with that? Because ultimately there is this kind of brick wall mentality among certain people who just didn't come up with what they wanted it to come up with.
Well, I hope it's the dead cat bounce. It's the desperate panicked reaction of a group of people who have married not just their reputations, but their very sanity to there being truth in an ideology that says children as young as 3 have a gender identity, they know it, and our job as adults is simply to guide them on that pathway to medication and then surgery. I wonder if that's what we're seeing, and that hopefully will at some stage wear itself out. But going back to the private clinics, we know we've got hopefully the judicial review coming up of Gender Plus that will look at their regulation. We've got the other problem, though, haven't we, of Gender GP. Now, remember, Dr. Mike Webberley was struck off after providing puberty blockers to a 9-year-old following a 20-minute Zoom call during which the child did not speak. There were lots of other patients. I think there are at least 21 he was investigated regarding. His wife, Dr. Helen, managed to escape being struck off despite never discussing issues of fertility with an 11-year-old girl and her mother for whom she prescribed testosterone. Now, Dr. Helen Webberley has been utterly unrepentant about this and says, basically, sod the Cass review, sod the NHS, we'll give the kids what they need. So I think the government's really got to show its commitment to some of the encouraging statements. There needs to be action taken against these people.
Now, when you say action, Do you mean criminal action?
Yes, I think it should be criminalised to do what Helen Webberley is doing, to exist outside of UK regulation and be prescribing testosterone to young girls. And I think if the government doesn't act, and I'm really actually pleased by some of the strong pronouncements made, then we must act by way of private prosecution, because we've got CAS now as our ethical and factual ballast. So if the government won't act or are slow to act, then we've got to do it.
Is there a fear, though? I mean, I'm talking later in the show to Dr. Carrie Mendoza from America about how it's being received over there, and I noticed that the American media are barely touching this. I notice when things are going up about this that are supportive of the CAS review on YouTube, they're getting hit with context notes by YouTube. You know, there's a big weight of a global opinion that has a prejudice against CAS and the findings of her review.
We just have to continue in this country to do what we can to protect children and hope that message is taken up abroad. Obviously, we can't interfere with what the US decides to do legally, but it's a very significant note that CAS found only Sweden and Finland to produce reliable guidelines and found WPATH discredited. Now, I know what's recently happened in America with Biden passing into law gender identity on a par with sex. I think it's now for Americans to take the wheel in their own country. We will do what we can for American children, but obviously we can't influence their laws. But one thing that is coming down the track, remember the 9,000 children who were funneled through the Tavistock, 6 out of 7 of the gender clinics refused to cooperate with CAS and give her the data. Now, that can only be for 2 reasons. A, they didn't keep the data, they're going to be revealed as incompetent, or B, they know exactly what that data is going to show. Remarkably poor outcomes for that cohort.
Well, we don't have data sufficiently on detransitioners or regret in later life, and partly it's because, as you say, there's this reticence to either hand it over or maybe it just doesn't exist.
Well, that's the other big lie that's taken hold, isn't it? That only 1% of people detransition. And as CAS makes clear, there is simply no evidence to make any assertion about detransition. However, I would note that the Reddit group for detransitioners, I think now has 57,000 members. There's legal actions being brought in the States. There's legal actions here, Richie Herron. So that is the other big lie that we need to topple. I don't know what the rate is, but my suspicion is it's going to have to be more than 1%, because you're looking at a group of children often with internalised homophobia, mental health comorbidities, adverse childhood experiences, being given medication as the cure for everything that ailed them. And of course it won't be.
Can I ask you a bigger question? You mentioned earlier the affirming approach, and the idea of gender affirming care is that a child says they're in the wrong body, says that they have an innate gender identity, and the doctor must immediately affirm that. But isn't this effectively a kind of pseudo-religious belief? And if that's the case, why is the NHS even entertaining it to begin with?
Oh, absolutely. I've been saying that for a long time. And so have many others. It's not me being particularly clever. Gender identity is like the soul. You see the reaction when you go against gender identity. It's the same as a fervently religious person when you say you don't believe. The anger, the rage, the lack of evidence, the punishment for the apostate. That's very clear. I mean, it's going to be, I hope, in about 10 years' time, there'll be a lot of books written about how the hell did this happen. But I think the groundwork was laid decades ago. See the Yogyakarta principles. A lot of money seemed to be funneled into this in the late 90s about how gender identity was going to be elevated above sex at any cost. It became a human rights, a civil liberties issue, and then for some bizarre reason, we haven't quite got to the bottom of this yet, doctors were persuaded to go against the fundamental ethical tenets of their profession. First, do no harm. If you're going to be innovative, that's wonderful. We need doctors to be innovative, but they need to collect the data.
Well, what do you say to the critics of the review who will say, but data when it comes to paediatric medicine is notoriously difficult to locate, and actually we shouldn't be expecting... I mean, Dr. Aidan Kelly, on that very interview that I mentioned, said that actually, yeah, we'd love to have that gold standard of firm data on everything, but actually it's neither possible nor desirable when it comes to gender medicine.
Well, that just seems to me such an insanely stupid thing to say when we know that 9,000 children have gone through the Tavistock. Where are they now? Are they living their best lives, happy and transitioned? I hope they are. You see, Andrew, I would be delighted to be wrong about this, because if I am right, that is 9,000 children who've been deprived of fertility, of adult sexual function, and it was all done for an adult ideology with no evidence base. And I think the difference... I know everyone's saying, oh, it's both sides, it's both sides. I think the difference between my side and the gender identity side is I will be delighted to be wrong and I will say hallelujah. The other side, however, when that data comes in and shows what I believe it will, that cohort had their lives blighted, they will simply lie about it, as we've seen now.
Well, that's another criticism of Cass, isn't it? That actually she hasn't been sufficiently compassionate to the children involved here. I've read the review and I don't think that's the case at all.
Well, you cannot say that in good faith unless you have some quite serious learning difficulty. The compassion that she feels for this children is fundamentally displayed throughout that report. She directly addresses the children she knows she is going to disappoint. But this is the dynamic between adults and children. We don't say, I will give you everything you want so you'll be my friend and you'll love me. You say, I am the adult here and I'm not going to give you what you want, I'm going to give you what you need because you are a child and I know better. So that is effectively what she says, and she says it with deep compassion. So that's just another lie, another very stupid and irritating lie.
Sarah Phillimore, thank you ever so much for joining me.